Hey guys, Caleb here from CDBS Studios, and welcome back to the series where I am going through the entire MCU timeline. Last episode, we ventured outside of the MCU sacred timeline and talked about the multiverse, but today we are heading back to the sacred timeline for the fourth and final part of this series, the Multiverse Saga. If you want to catch up to where we currently are in the series, I encourage you to go watch the previous 3 videos in the series, and if you want to know the logistics of the projects, I did also make a part 0, which was the project logistics. But for right now, let's jump into the fourth and final part of this series, the Multiverse Saga. We resume our timeline 1 week after the events of Avengers Endgame, where we have the main events of WandaVision, where Wanda, after the events of the Battle of New York, wants to give Vision a proper burial, but the new government branch called SWORD wants to keep the Vision's body for studying it. Wanda, of course, leaves the facility after seeing the damaged body, and after being so grief-stricken by Vision's death, accidentally unleashes a huge amount of chaos energy that puts a spell over the entire town of Westview, turning it into a sitcom-like reality like the ones Wanda grew up loving to watch. She ends up living in this reality with a version of Vision for a couple weeks before eventually SWORD catches on and dispatches Darcy Lewis, Monica Rambeau, and Jimmy Woo to investigate the Hex before Monica gets sucked inside a couple times, giving her some superpowers. The Hex also ends up actually attracting the powerful witch known as Agatha Harkness, who wants to absorb Wanda's chaos magic because she read about her in the Darkhold, this dark magic book that Agatha has. Eventually, this leads to also SWORD getting some of Wanda's energy and actually reviving the Vision's body that they have to turn it into White Vision. This leads to a final confrontation where the Vision of the Westview Hex actually gives his memories back to the White Vision, allowing it to fly. Wanda is unfortunately forced to say goodbye to her world that she created, including her version of Vision and the kids that she created. And she is also able to defeat Agatha Harkness and put a personalized hex on her, turning her permanently into the nosy neighbor she played on the show. Monica is then recruited by a couple of Skrulls to go up into space on a special mission for Nick Fury, and Wanda ends up flying off away from Westview. However, at the same time, a young kid by the name of William Kaplan actually holds his bar mitzvah in the nearby town of Eastview. However, when his bar mitzvah is actually happening at the same time Wanda's hex is actually closing. And when the hex actually closes, the Kaplans end up getting in a bad car crash, and William Kaplan actually dies. However, Billy Maximoff, one of Wanda's 2 kids, his soul ends up actually transferring into William Kaplan's body, and therefore Billy becomes William. This then jumps us to a couple months later where we reconnect with Wanda Maximoff as she acquired the Darkhold from Agatha Harkness and is reading through it in an astral form, much like Doctor Strange. However, while reading the Darkhold, she ends up hearing her kids, Billy and Tommy, but from a different universe. This then brings us into the events of 2024, where we start off with the events of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, where Shang-Chi has been living in America for some time now under the false name of Sean and has become friends with this other valet chauffeur he knows in San Francisco named Katie. However, they are then taken by Wenwu and his Ten Rings compound to the Ten Rings compound because Wenwu has actually been hearing voices and cries from Shang-Chi's mother from the Dragon Scale Gate in Ta Lo. Of course, Shang-Chi and, of course, his sister Xiaoxiling believe he's crazy, but he ends up stealing their jade necklaces their mom gave them to reveal the secret location to Ta Lo so he can go there and free her himself. They eventually actually escape, and using Trevor Slattery, who's also been at the Ten Rings compound for a while, to actually get to Ta Lo, where they actually discover that the Dweller in Darkness is mimicking their mom's voice to try to convince Wenwu to use the Ten Rings to open the gate. They end up training at Ta Lo for a little while before Wenwu's forces arrive, and Wenwu actually opens the gate, and the Dweller in Darkness and the Soul Suckers are released and start powering up for a final battle. However, Wenwu decides, after seeing he has been wronged the whole time, decides to sacrifice himself to give Shang-Chi the Ten Rings and give him a fighting chance against the Dweller in Darkness. Shang-Chi is eventually able to defeat the Dweller in Darkness using the Ten Rings, which allows Kunlun to be finally free of the Dweller in Darkness. This and Shang-Chi and Katie return to San Francisco, but not before they are picked up by Wong, who tells them that the 10 rings have some kind of beacon inside of them that activated when Shang-Chi used their power, and it turns out that Wong, Carol Danvers, and Bruce Banner are going to look into it a little further. While at the same time, across the world, Xiao Shiling actually takes her place as the new ruler of the 10 rings, of the 10 rings organization. This leads us into the first 5 episodes of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where over the last couple months since he got the shield, Sam has begun to question himself as to whether he was the right person for the Captain America legacy. So he decides to hand the shield over to the Smithsonian, who puts it in the Captain America exhibit they already have. However, shortly after the fact, the government actually takes the shield and gives it to a new man named John Walker, making him the new Captain America. While at the same time, Sam Wilson and Bucky Barnes team up to take down a terrorist group known as the Flag Smashers, who have this belief that the world was better during the blip and want to try to return to that state. Eventually these two they pick up some extra help from Baron Zemo, who they break out of prison before he eventually betrays them, and the Wakandans show up to take Zemo back to a Wakandan prison, and Sharon Carter ends up actually helping them a little bit as well. In the end, John Walker, during the events of episode 5 that we come to, John Walker ends up going a little too far when his best friend Battlestar is actually killed by one of the Flag Smashers, and John Walker uses the Captain America shield to beat in someone's skull on the sidewalk. This causes Bucky and Sam to team up to actually steal the shield back, and Sam and Bucky ends up training Sam to use the shield properly, while at the same time the Flag Smashers plan their final attack, and John Walker manufactures a new shield out of metal that he plans to use. This brings us into the opening of Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, where over the last couple months since Endgame, T'Challa has contracted some kind of illness, and Shuri has buried her in her research to try to find a cure for him. However, she is not able to devise a cure as the heart-shaped herb is still destroyed from when Killmonger burned it all, and unfortunately T'Challa passes away. This leads to Wakanda for having a funeral to mourn their king, and Queen Ramonda actually takes back over as the Queen of Wakanda until Shuri is ready to take up the mantle. However, shortly after this, Shuri ends up burying herself more into research, trying to replicate the heart-shaped herb. This leads us into the events where we see Thor eventually starting to work out with the Guardians and going on missions with them, and at the same time he begins working out to try to get rid of the dad bod he created during the blip. This brings us into the main events of Spider-Man: Far From Home, where Peter Parker has been mourning Tony Stark ever since the events of the Battle of Earth, and everyone in the entire world keeps asking who's going to be the next Iron Man, and they believe Spider-Man is going to be that person. However, Peter, all he wants to do is ditch all of his hero work to go on a Europe trip with his class, where he finally plans to reveal to MJ that he has feelings for her. Their first stop is Italy, where while they're in Italy, Peter buys this Black Dahlia necklace to give to her, and plans to give to her when they end up in Paris. However, at the same time, the city is attacked by a water monster, and they're saved by a mysterious man. Peter then later that night in his hotel room is picked up by Nick Fury and is put into contact with the man who is Quentin Beck, aka a hero from another Earth called Mysterio. They learn that they're creatures called elementals that have been breaking through the dimensional barrier into the world to destroy it. Nick Fury and Mysterio have already defeated the Earth and the air elementals, and they defeated the water elemental in Venice. However, the fire elemental is about to arise in Prague, so Nick Fury plans to take Peter there so they can use some extra help. He also ends up giving Peter these special glasses that were left behind by Tony, so that Peter has a little extra technology on his side. However, Peter just wants to return to his class trip, so Nick Fury originally says he's going to let him go on the trip, but before he ends up hijacking the trip's plan to get Peter and the whole class to Prague. This leads to Peter and Mysterio working together to defeat the fire elemental, and while they're hanging out in a bar afterwards, Peter ends up getting the idea to give Edith the special glasses from Tony Stark to Quentin Beck, which he does. It is then revealed that Quentin Beck is actually a liar, and he has been using illusion tech designed by Tony Stark to fake the elemental storyline, and the glasses are what he finally needs to make an Avengers level threat out of this drone illusion technology, so that he can become the next so he can be like the ruler of the world. Peter eventually comes onto the scheme and ends up tracking Beck to his scheme in London, where Peter is finally forced to rise up and take out Beck's drones. However, during the fight, one of the drones actually backfires and ends up actually killing Quentin Beck with his firearms. After the battle, Peter ends up meeting back up with NJ, and he finally ends up revealing his feelings to her, and she ends up feeling the exact same way. However, when they return to New York, Peter ends up swinging MJ around the city for an afternoon date before they end up seeing a news footage from the Daily Bugle, where apparently Mysterio had one final trick up his sleeve, as a video was received by the Bugle where Mysterio reveals to the whole world that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. This leads us into the opening events of Spider-Man No Way Home, where after Peter's identity gets revealed, Peter is forced to hastily swing him and MJ back to his house, where he reveals to both Aunt May and Happy what's going on, and the Spider-Man controversy officially begins. This leads us into the sixth event, the sixth and final episode of Falcon and Winter Soldier, where the Flag Smashers end up attacking the GRC headquarters in New York City, which causes both Bucky, Sharon, and Sam to team up to go after the Flag Smashers. This results in the head Flag Smasher, Carly Morgenthau, actually dying, and Sam and Bucky and Sam officially takes on the role as Captain America. Shortly afterwards, John Walker is actually recruited by Valentina Allegra de Fontaine to become a new superhero, U.S. agent. Well, at the same time, Sharon Carter actually gets a pardon from the United States to come back after she was outlawed during the events of Civil War. However, it's revealed that she is now a supervillain called the Power Broker, who has been running the criminal country of Madripoor for the last 5 years. And Sam Wilson and Bucky Barnes officially go on together to become superheroes. This leads us into coming back to the Spider-Man controversy, where Peter Parker and his friends have had the toughest time ever with all of their things behind the scenes, trying to make, as they've been charged with tons of different things because of Mysterio's video, but thankfully with help from Matt Murdock, all of their charges are able to get dropped. However, he is actually then hired by Happy Hogan to make sure that he gets out of trouble, but because people start throwing bricks through the windows of the apartment that Peter and May live in, they decide to move into Happy's way more secure condo. This leads us into the opening of She-Hulk Attorney at Law, where while Bruce Banner is on a drive with his cousin Jennifer Walters, the two of them end up getting in a car crash, and some of Bruce's blood actually gets inside of Jen's veins, turning her into a Hulk. Bruce actually takes her to a secret facility he has in Mexico, where he spent the blip, where he turned into Smart Hulk, so that he can train her to be a Hulk herself. He ends up training her for a little while until she finally gets hold of her Hulk side, before she ends up returning to her job as a lawyer. This leads us into the main events of Eternals, where the emergence on Earth is about to actually happen. Tiamat is about to emerge out of the surface, and the Eternals are forced to come back together to try to prevent it. However, they learn that one of their leader, Ajak, is actually dead and was killed by a deviant who now has the ability to absorb their powers. And Cersei is named the new leader of the Eternals. Together, they end up trying to uncover everything, trying to figure out try to reassemble the team and figure out what's going on with the deviants. While at the same time, another one of their members, Gilgamesh, is actually killed by that same deviant, who is named Crow, who actually absorbs his power as well. It is then later revealed by Cersei. They find out the truth about the emergence, and they find out that they actually have to stop it. It is then revealed that Icarus, one of the Under Eternals, actually knew about the emergence, and when Ajak actually considered stopping it herself, he actually gave her to the last deviants on the planet in order to power them up while also killing her, which is why he was not named the next leader of the Eternals, much like everybody thought he was going to. Icarus then decides to turn on the Eternals to go to try to make the emergence happen with one of their other members, Sprite, who actually is in love with Icarus. The two of them end up fighting the Eternals, while the Eternals are able to overpower them, and they come together to form a hive mind, which they actually use to stop Tiamat and turn him into a rock that now has his hand and head sticking out of the ocean. Icarus, feeling remorse for his actions, actually flies into the sun to kill himself. Thena, actually so mad at Crow for what he did to Gilgamesh, actually ends up killing Crow. And Cersei, having all the powers of their collective hive mind, is able to grant Sprite the one wish that she always wanted, to become an actual human. Shortly after the events, Thena, Makari, and Druig actually leave Earth to go find other Eternals to warn them of the emergences to try to stop them. But while they are gone, the other Eternals on Earth, Cersei Cersei, Phastos, and Kingo are actually taken by the leader of the Celestials, Erishim, to be judged for their crimes against the earth. While at the same time, the current love interest of Cersei, known as Dane Whitman, actually decides to uncover his father's old Black Knight sword, and he teams up with Blade to eventually go find Cersei. This finally leads us into the events of Spider-Man No Way Home, where Peter Parker and his friends have been trying to apply to colleges, but they keep getting kicked out of every single college they know just because of the Spider-Man controversy. This causes Peter to eventually go to Doctor Strange to ask him for his help in trying to undo the reveal of his identity, and Doctor Strange has a spell that'll mind wipe the fact that Peter Parker Spider-Man from everyone on the planet. Peter, however, gets cold feet and keeps trying to change the spell to accommodate all of the different people he still wants to remember, and accidentally ends up ripping a hole in the multiverse, causing people from other universes who know Peter Parker is Spider-Man to tumble into the main MCU universe. This involves Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Sandman, Electro, and the Lizard. Peter ends up rounding all these villains up before he ends up realizing that they all got pulled from their universes at the moments when they were about to die. And Peter, not wanting them to die, ends up going against Doctor Strange to imprison him in the mirror dimension and take the villains to Happy's condo to try to cure them all. However, while he's trying to cure them, he does end up curing Doc Ock, but Green Goblin ends up turning on them and convincing all of the villains that their powers are not curses, they're gifts. They all then turn on Peter and leave the condo, but not before Green Goblin actually kills Aunt May. At the same time, Ned and MJ are actually been hiding out with the magic spell box that will send all the villains back to their universes at a different place. And while Ned is trying to open a portal to Peter Parker, he ends up summoning in two alternate versions of Peter Parker from the two different universes of the actual villains. They end up reuniting with the Peter from the main MCU universe, and the three Spider-Men end up working together to cure all of the different villains. And originally, the MCU Peter, wants to kill Green Goblin for what he did to Doc Ock, but he is stopped by the Raimiverse Peter because he does stop at Raimiverse Peter and is able to cure Green Goblin. While at the same time, the box that was containing the magical spell actually ends up breaking and ripping holes in the universe that's going to draw everyone from every single universe who knows Peter Parker's identity into the MCU universe. Peter then makes the ultimate sacrifice by having Doctor Strange cast the spell again, but everybody on the planet will forget Peter Parker even exists. The spell ends up working, all the villains and Peters end up going back to their universes, and Peter Parker ends up forgotten by the entire living world. But we're not done with Doctor Strange just yet, as we come into the main events of Doctor Strange: The Multiverse of Madness, where a being from another universe named America Chavez ends up crashing into the main MCU universe, and she has the rare ability to open portals between the different universes. Doctor Strange learns that she is actually being pursued by multiple different monsters who actually have magical qualities, so he goes to Wanda Maximoff to actually ask her for help. He then learns that she is actually the one who is after America Chavez, and she wants America's power so that she can open a portal to another universe so she can go be with her children. Doctor Strange originally tries to protect America Chavez at Carmitage before Wanda attacks, and after getting scared, America and Doctor Strange actually tumble outside of this universe into the universe of 838. Wanda ends up actually using the concept called dreamwalking to actually dreamwalk into the Wanda Maximoff of that universe to go after Doctor Strange and America Chavez, eventually pulling in America back into the main universe, while at the same time Doctor Strange ends up on a completely different Earth that he finds the Darkhold of, and he dreamwalks into a dead version of Doctor Strange that landed on the main MCU universe with America Chavez to fight Wanda alongside America Chavez. America is able to fully master her powers and actually gives Wanda what she wants. But when she sees that her children are actually afraid of what she's become, Wanda makes the sacrifice to collapse the Darkhold Temple in the main MCU universe, and by extension, destroy the Darkhold on every subsequent universe, also killing herself. Doctor Strange then returns to the main MCU universe, but not before the Darkhold takes its toll on him by giving him a third eye. Doctor Strange is then approached by a being from the dark dimension called Clea, who actually reveals that Doctor Strange's actions caused an incursion, and the two of them head into the dark dimension to try and prevent it. Then we come back to Peter Parker, who after a couple weeks trying to figure out what he's going to say, goes to the coffee shop where MJ works to try to reveal to her that he is actually Spider-Man and trying to get her to remember. However, after seeing that she has a bruise on her head and that her and Ned have gotten an MIT, he chooses to stay forgotten by the two of them. Peter then ends up visiting Aunt May's grave and having a little interaction with Happy Hogan before Peter ends up getting a new apartment and officially designing a new Spider-Man suit as he swings on, officially taking on the role of Spider-Man. This brings us into the Christmas season of 2024, where we have the main events of Hawkeye, where Clint Barton is just trying to spend a simple Christmas with his family, but another archer who idolizes Clint named Kate Bishop actually infiltrates a secret auction that is happening, which has a bunch of stuff from the Avengers compound, which actually has a watch and also Clint's old Ronin suit. Kate actually ends up stealing the suit to wear it, and it ends up causing distress from a gang known as the Tracksuit Mafia, who has beef with Ronin from the past. Clint is forced to team up with Kate to try to undo all the damage that she did and protect her from the Ten Rings, and they end up coming into contact with Echo. While at the same time, while Clint is getting more involved with Kate, her mother, Eleanor Bishop, actually talks to Valentina Legre de Fontaine, who ends up hiring Elena, which we see in the post-credit scene of Black Widow, where to go after Clint Barton. This results in Clint and Elena going after Clint, actually believing that Clint is actually the reason Natasha died. Eventually, Clint is able to clear up with Yelena about what happened, and the two of them end up ending on roughly good terms, but at the same time, they end up having other problems as it's revealed that Kingpin is the leader of the Tracksuit Mafia and decides to goes after Clint, Kate, Echo, who actually learns that Kingpin is actually the one who hired Clint to kill her father all those years ago, and they go after all of them, eventually able to defeat Eleanor and the Tracksuit Mafia, while at the same time, Echo ends up tracking down Wilson Fisk and ends up shooting him in the eye. At the same time, Clint ends up allowing Kate to go to his farm with him to spend Christmas with him, and they together burn the Ronin suit. This leads us finally into the events of 2025, where Wendy, Mark Spector's mother, has actually passed away, and her Shiva is actually held. Mark eventually is originally planning to attend the event, but he ends up getting cold feet at the door and ends up walking away crying, before he ends up switching into the Stephen Grant personality in the middle of the street, Stephen Grant obviously having no idea where he is. Then we come finally to the first three events of She-Hulk Attorney at Law, where Jennifer Walters tries to return to her normal life as a lawyer, but her Hulk side eventually does get revealed, which does end up getting her fired, and she's not able to find work anywhere else. She eventually is able to get hired by a new law firm, but the shtick is she actually has to remain in her She-Hulk firm all of the time, and she will now represent superheroes or superpowered individuals. The first of her clients is actually Emil Blonsky's Abomination from The Incredible Hulk. Her goal is to actually get him on his parole. After multiple episodes of originally trying, also having some references from Wong himself, who actually broke Emil out to use him as a training as he's the new Sorcerer Supreme, eventually she is able to get Emil on his parole, and Emil is very, very grateful for that. We then come into the main events of Moon Knight, where Stephen Grant has been working as a normal museum teller before he finally learns of his alternate side as Mark Spector and his life as Moon Knight. Mark Spector and his aunt has been tasked by Khonshu to actually find a scarab who a dangerous man named Arthur Harrow, who is Khonshu's previous avatar, is trying to use to unleash another goddess named Amit, who is going to literally who Khonshu only punishes people who has walked the light of day. Amit will punish anybody who may compete, who may walk dangerous paths later in life, not even giving them the choice to make that decision. So Mark and Steven end up working together to try to stop the scarab, but when Arthur Harrow gets it, they end up tracking him to Egypt, eventually coming into contact with Mark Spector's wife, Layla, and they end up working together to get into the tomb to stop her from getting Amit, but in the end, Harrow actually shoots Mark and Steven and ends up killing them. The two of them end up on the duo where they end up learning about each other, where Steven finally ends up learning about Mark's dangerous past, and they end up becoming stronger because of that. So when they return to the living world, they are a much more unified entity that are able to work together to go after Arthur Harrow, who has now become the avatar for Amit. Eventually, they are able to imprison Amit inside of Harrow's body, but Mark is unable to kill Harrow, and as part of a deal, Steven and Mark are relinquished from being Khonshu's avatar, and they are officially allowed to go back to their normal lives. Then we come to the one of the opening events of Thor: Love and Thunder, where Jane Foster has unfortunately attracted some cancer that she can't actually get rid of. It's the same thing her mom actually had. While she is in her in the doctor's office trying to think, she keeps hearing voices in her head, and she follows them all the way to New Asgard, where she ends up finding Mjolnir as the thing calling to her. And when she gets close enough, Mjolnir reassembles itself and actually gives Jane special powers, turning her into the mighty Thor. This brings us to the main events of Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, where Shuri is still desperately trying to recreate the heart-shaped herb, but still unable to do it. But that is when they end up her and Ramonda are actually approached by Namor, the leader of Talokan, another civilization with vibranium in the ocean around Mexico. They've been actually attacked by the American government, because they have discovered that the vibranium lives there because a vibranium locator was actually created by some kid at MIT. Shuri ends up tracking this to MIT, where they end up finding Riri Williams, someone who is a huge fan of Iron Man and has built a makeshift Iron Man suit, is the one that Talokan wants. And because she's just a kid, of course, they're not actually going to go after. They're not going to turn her in. They try to hide her, but they end up getting attacked by Namor. Shuri and Riri are actually taken to Talokan, but because Okoye have no idea where they went, she actually is relinquished from being the leader of the Dora Milaje. Eventually, Shuri and Riri are able to escape and head back to Wakanda, but Wakanda then ends up getting attacked by the Talokans, and Namor actually ends up killing Ramonda. Shuri, just wanting all-out revenge on Namor, is finally able to use some of the vibranium plants that she ended up stealing from Talokan to actually recreate the heart-shaped herb and give her the power of the Black Panther. However, while Shuri does this, she crosses over to the ancestral plane, where she doesn't meet who she thinks she's going to meet, which is going to be T'Challa. She meets Killmonger, who actually encourages Shuri to take hold of her revenge. Shuri then leads the Wakandan warriors in the battle against Talokan, plus Riri, who has a new vibranium suit, where they end up fighting Talokan. But Shuri, finally deciding that she doesn't want to be like Killmonger, she wants to be more like her brother T'Challa, decides to spare Talokan and actually ends up forming an alliance with them. At the very end, of course, unfortunately, Riri is not allowed to keep her vibranium suit, and is forced to leave in Wakanda as she returns to her life at MIT. While at the same time, Shuri decides to abandon her post as king of Wakanda, and the king is given to M'Baku. Shuri ends up heading over to Haiti, where she ends up with Nakia, and she actually learns that T'Challa had a son named T'Challa Jr. This then leads us into the ending of Moon Knight, where Arthur Harrow, and by extension Ahmed, is actually rolled out of an insane asylum by a mysterious person, where once Harrow gets into a limousine, he ends up meeting Khonshu, and he reminds Khonshu that he can't do anything against him before Khonshu ends up revealing his new avatar, which he says that Mark and Steven thought that they would be able to get rid of him, but it turns out they have a third personality named Jake Lockley, who is now Khonshu's avatar, who ends up killing Arthur Harrow, and by extension, Amit. This leads us into the main events of Echo, which after believing to have killed Kingpin at the end of Hawkeye, Maya Lopez returns to her hometown in Oklahoma to stop Kingpin's operations there. He eventually learns that Kingpin is actually alive, and the two of them end up coming in heads before Echo is finally able to unlock the special powers of Chafa from the Choctaw tribe, where she actually uses it to heal Kingpin's eye, and the two of them officially go their separate ways. But on the way back to New York, Kingpin actually gets the idea to run for mayor. Leads us into the rest of the first season of She-Hulk, where Jennifer Walters goes on many other adventures, getting many other clients across the different episodes, eventually also coming into contact with Daredevil Matt Murdock, and they end up forming a little bit of a relationship, before She-Hulk is eventually also introduced to Hulk, who has a son now, Scar. This leads us into the opening of Thor: Love and Thunder, where Gorr is a simple man who is starving and looking for their god, Rapu, to try to ask for some things, as he believes there's a reward to if he finds them. While he is actually going through his journey, his daughter actually dies. Gore eventually does find his god of approval when the god laughs in his face. Gore eventually comes into possession of something called the Necro Sword, a sword that can actually kill gods. Gore ends up officially becoming the God Butcher and vows that all gods will die. This leads us into the main events of Miss Marvel, where Kamala Khan is a simple kid in Jersey City who actually idolizes superheroes. At this point in the MCU, who doesn't idolize superheroes? Before she ends up actually going to a Avengers Con, she ends up modeling her suit after Carol Danvers, and she ends up wearing a bangle that she got from her grandma. However, the bangle ends up unlocking mysterious powers inside of Kamala. Kamala ends up finally coming into contact with her ancestors, Najma and the rest of the clandestines, who actually want to use the bangle to return to their home, the Noor Dimension. Kamala originally wants to help them, but before realizing that carrying the dimensions could actually cause serious damage, she tries to run from them, actually also falling in love with Najma's son, Kamran, in the process. Kamala does also go over to Pakistan for a little bit to learn a little bit of the history of her family, and also have a little bit of time travel escapade that we covered in a previous episode, before Najma actually ends up sacrificing herself to close the Noor Dimension rift that ends up opening in Pakistan, and actually gives powers to Kamran. Kamran is not able to control these powers, so the DODC actually wants to apprehend Kamran. Kamala ends up teaming up with her family in Jersey City to actually protect Kamran and get him out of the city, and at the same time, Kamala ends up officially donning her brand new suit, and also her name, Miss Marvel. This leads into the main events of Thor: Love and Thunder, where Thor finally comes into knowing of Gore's existence, and so abandons the Guardians in order to go after him. He ends up reuniting with his team on New Asgard, that being Valkyrie, Korg, and also Jane, who is now Mighty Thor. And they also have to team up together as Gore ends up actually taking the New Asgard kids to try to lure Thor into a final battle. This is when they finally learn that Gore's plan is actually to use the Stormbreaker weapon and the Bifrost to actually open up the door to the entity known as Eternity, which it's said whoever reaches her will actually be able to be granted one wish, and if Gore does, he'll be able to kill all gods in one foul swoop. Originally, Thor heads to Omnipotent City to ask for help from the other gods like Zeus and them, but they end up laughing in his face, so Thor just ends up stealing Zeus's weapon, the Thunderbolt, and ends up heading off his way to go fight Gore. Unfortunately, he does end up losing Mjolnir in this fight, and also Gore now has exactly what he needs. Thor, unfortunately, also has to bring both Valkyrie, Korg, and Jane back to Earth as they all got injured, and they find that Jane's cancer is actually being nullified by the hammer, and the more and more she uses it, she cannot fight off the cancer herself. Thor leaves them all to go after Gore, but in the time of need, Jane actually sacrifices herself to actually take out Gore's Necro Sword to defeat him. But when Gore actually reaches Eternity, Thor actually encourages him to make a different witch, which Gore actually does. Gore's daughter, Love, actually is brought back to life, and Gore promises to look after her as Jane also passes away. This leads us into the main events of Ironheart, where Riri Williams has been spending a little bit more time at MIT after the events of Wakanda Forever before she is eventually expelled. Riri then takes her suit that she was building at MIT back to Chicago, where she continues to work on it a little bit, and she actually ends up accidentally using her brain to create a new... She tries originally to create a new AI for her suit, but ends up accidentally creating a version of her dead friend Natalie as a version of AI. Riri also ends up coming into contact with a criminal group started by Parker Robbins, aka the Hood. Riri originally starts working with Parker Robbins to try to stop his operations, while at the same time working with a man named Ezekiel Stain, the son of Obadiah Stane, to actually help upgrade her suit. Eventually, she comes into conflict with both the Hood and also Ezekiel Stain. Eventually, Riri also makes a brand new suit that she also powers up with magic to try to combat Parker Robbins. However, the process of this also ends up deleting Natalie from existence. This leads to Riri end up having a final battle with both Ezekiel and Parker Robbins, where she is actually able to steal Parker Robbins' hood that gives him power. Riri is then approached by the demon known as Mephisto, where Riri actually makes a deal with him that brings Natalie back to life, but unfortunately indebts her to Mephisto. While at the same time, Parker Robbins actually teams up with another witch in Chicago to try to go after Riri. This leads us into the openings of Daredevil Born Again, where while Foggy Nelson is actually working on a different case, he ends up learning that Vanessa Fisk is actually money laundering through the Red Hook port in New York City. In order to stop this information from getting out there, she ends up hiring Ben Poindexter, aka Bullseye, to actually take out Foggy Nelson, Matt Murdock, and Karen Page. This leads into the first episode of Daredevil Born Again, where while after a long day of work, the crew of Nelson, Murdock, and Page end up meeting up at Josie's bar to have a drink when it is attacked by Bullseye. Matt is eventually able to ward off Bullseye, but not before Foggy ends up actually dying, officially ending Nelson, Murdock, and Page. This leads us into the main events of Werewolf by Night, where a group of monster hunters end up meeting up at the Bloodstone residence to compete after the head of the family ends up dying, to compete for the sacred Bloodstone, an ancient artifact that can actually ward off any monster it chooses. One of the members of this group is Jack Russell. However, Jack Russell is here on a different mission, as he is trying to break out the monster they have captured, Man-Thing. Eventually, he ends up teaming up with one of the Bloodstone family's cast out person, Elsa Bloodstone. Eventually, it is also revealed that Jack Russell is an actual monster himself, the Werewolf by Night. Originally, the new head of the family, Verussa Bloodstone, tries to use the Werewolf by Night to actually kill Elsa, but he ends up turning on her with Man-Thing to kill her before running off into the sunset with Man-Thing. Elsa Bloodstone then takes over the Bloodstone residence and becomes the new holder of the Bloodstone. This finally leads us to the 2025 Christmas season with Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special, where Peter Quill has been feeling really down in the last couple years after losing Gamora in the events of Infinity War, and the Guardians want a way to cheer him up. And over all the years, he has talked about one person above all others, Kevin Bacon. So Drax and Mantis actually go down to Earth to try to take Kevin Bacon and to use him as a Christmas gift. They're eventually able to get him there, but Peter Quill, of course, is disgusted by the idea of them giving him a human, so he originally rejects it. And Kevin Bacon is obviously still terrified of this whole experience, but it's not until Kraglin actually explains the reason why they did it that he realizes the Guardians really need some Christmas cheer. So he ends up singing a song to them and ends up giving them the Christmas cheer that they all wanted before he returns back to Earth. The reason that they all did this, however, was because Kraglin told a story about how Yondu ruined Christmas. Peter ends up telling the different version of the story, how Yondu actually admired Christmas, and this is also when Mantis reveals to Peter Quill that she is his sister. This brings us into 2026, where we learn that the narration of the Thor Love and Thunder is actually Korg telling a story to the new Asgard children, and at the same time we see a flash forward to when Thor and Love have been hanging out for a little while now, and the two of them end up going off together to protect the cosmos. This leads us into the main events of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, where Scott Lang has been living pretty good ever since the events of Avengers Endgame. He's released a book talking about his experience, and he's generally going pretty well, with also with Hope opening a brand new company known as the Pim Van Dyne Foundation, that she uses Pim particles to benefit reality. And also, Cassie is now a teenager and starting to cause a little bit of mischief, which Scott is not so happy about. Before Cassie ends up actually showing something that her and Hank have been working on, which is a satellite, but for the quantum realm. Janet is actually appalled at this idea, but before the device actually goes haywire and all of them get sucked down into the quantum realm. This is where they learn that Kang has officially taken over the quantum realm and turned it into his own personal kingdom. Cassie and Scott are actually taken by Kang, and Kang actually threatens Scott with Cassie to force him to go get his core for his time-traveling spaceship that Janet destroyed all the years ago. Eventually, the team ends up coming back together and working together to stop Kang before all of them end up returning back to the surface while Kang gets end up stuck in a further level of the quantum realm. Scott is actually weirdly happy that everything goes to normal, but he's a little bit scared that Kang may come back someday. Then we come into the main events of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, where while the Guardians are hanging out on their new base of Nowhere, they are actually attacked by Adam Warlock, who originally tries to take Rocket, but he ends up just injuring him. Rocket ends up falling into a cosis, and they can't end up operating on him because he has a kill switch in design in him that they need to find a way to deactivate. This leads the Guardians to actually reuniting with the 2014 variant of Gamora from Endgame to actually break into the High Evolutionaries base to learn how they can actually save Rocket. They eventually are able to do so, but Rocket ends up not wanting to run from the High Evolutionary anymore and actually going after him. While at the same time, the Sovereign from Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 2 are actually associates of the High Evolutionary, and the High Evolutionary actually ends up killing them, causing Adam Warlock to also turn on him. And after they all work together, the High Evolutionary is actually defeated, and they are able to set all of his demonic creatures actually free. While at the same time, the Guardians actually feel that this is the perfect time to consider some different roles and leadership, and Rocket becomes the new leader of the Guardians of the Galaxy to actually form a new generation of them involving Groot, Kraglin, Cosmo the Space Dog, Phyla, and Adam Warlock. While at the same time, Nebula and Drax stay back on Nowhere to take care of the new kids they saved from the High Evolutionary. Gamora goes off to rejoin the Ravengers. Mantis goes off to discover herself. And Peter Quill actually goes back down to Earth to reunite with his grandfather. This leads us into the first episode of Daredevil Born Again, which 1 year after Foggy Nelson's death, Matt has officially given up being Daredevil. He just doesn't want anything to do with it, and he's joined a new law firm called Murdoch and McDuffie. While they're working together, Matt actually comes to learn that Wilson Fisk is actually running for mayor of New York City. Matt and Fisk end up meeting up with one another to give each other a collective warning that Matt encourages Fisk not to do anything outside of the law, and Fisk encourages Matt not to go back to his old ways as Daredevil. This leads us into the main events of Secret Invasion, where the Skrulls that are currently living on Earth have gotten increasingly more frustrated that Fury and Carol have not found them a suitable home yet. So Gravik ends up leading a rebellion of Skrulls that go against the world, where they've actually been kidnapping multiple people up to this point to replace them to go against the world, that including Rhodey and actually Agent Ross. Eventually, Fury ends up coming back down from the Sword Space Station to team up with Talos and Murray Hill to actually defeat the Skrulls. Murray Hill and Talos actually end up getting killed by Gravik, and Fury is forced to rely on Talos' son, Gaia, who ends up becoming a super Skrull with the powers of every single MCU character to go after Gravik, which she is able to kill. Gaia is then hired by Sonya Falsworth to join another group of refugee Skrulls that are currently living on the planet, while Fury and his wife Vara end up going back up to the Sword Space Station. This leads us into the main events of the Marvels, where the Hala has fallen into a barren wasteland by this point, with no supreme intelligence and is fallen barren. This is when the current leader of Hala, known as Dar-Ben, discovers a mysterious bangle known as a quantum band that she can actually use to open jump points around the universe, and she plans to steal essential elements from planets Carol cares about to rebuild Hala. While discovering one of these mysterious jump points, Kamala Khan, Carol Danvers, and Monica Rambeau end up getting their powers mixed together with one another, causing them to actually switch places every time they use their powers, which leads into the post-credit scene of Ms. Marvel episode 6, where Kamala switches places with Carol. The three of them end up teaming up together to learn about their powers, to also go after Dar-Ben to eventually try to defeat her. Dar-Ben eventually is able to take possession of the second quantum band, which is actually the bangle Kamala has, and uses them to accidentally open up a rift between two different universes. In order to destroy it, Carol and Kamala try to use their powers to close it, while Monica goes to the other side to do the same. Unfortunately, Monica gets stranded on the other side. Carol and Kamala end up believing that she's not actually gone yet, and so end up dividing the two bangles between the two of them, agreeing that they will hope that Monica will return someday. This leads us into the main events of Agatha All Along, where William Kaplan, aka Billy Maximoff, is beginning to want his brother back, Tommy Maximoff. He eventually learns about the Witch's Road, the idea that if he walks down it, he can wish for anything he wants, and that Agatha is apparently the only survivor. He is able to use some of his rudimentary magic that he knows about to actually free Agatha from the hex that Wanda put on her, and the two of them end up forming a coven to walk down the Witch's Road. Eventually, slowly, each member of the team dies before eventually Billy learns that Agatha is actually lying about the Witch's Road, but they are able to end up doing an alternative where they are able to find Tommy a new body and are able to get him into it. However, Death, Rio Vidal, is also coming for them because she feels cheated out of Billy's soul because it didn't end up coming to her. It ended up going into William Kaplan's body. Eventually, the two of them are forced to fight Death before Agatha sacrifices herself to actually give Death a kiss, and she ends up dying in the process. She ends up, however, coming back as a ghost and ends up revealing to Billy that the Witch's Road was entirely fake, but it was real for them because he ended up using some dormant Scarlet Witch powers to make it real. The two of them end up deciding to go off together to actually go find where Tommy ended up. This leads us into the ending of the Marvels, where Kamala has decided that there needs to be a new team of superheroes in the world, so she ends up going to recruit Kate Bishop to her team, while also revealing that she knows about Cassie Lang. This leads us into the New Year's Eve of 2026, where while walking home from his apartment, Hector Ayala ends up finding some people beating up another group in a subway tunnel. He ends up stepping in to help the group, where one of them ends up actually dying. They are then revealed that they are actually cops, and Hector Ayala just killed the cops while he wasn't in his vigilante suit. Hector Ayala is a vigilante known as White Tiger. This leads us into 2027, where we first start off with Ross's inauguration, where General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross from The Incredible Hulk and a couple other instances has actually now been elected the President of the United States under his new business model, Togetherness. He is inaugurated at this point and officially starts his term as President of the United States. This leads us into the rest of the events of Daredevil Born Again, where Matt Murdock, after hearing about Hector Ayala, tries to represent him in court and actually reveals that he is White Tiger. And while he is originally able to get him exonerated of all charges, he is then later killed by a task force that Fisk has now started up to take out vigilantes around the city. This eventually comes to a head where Matt Murdock is officially forced to regain his role as Daredevil, and he teams up with Punisher Frank Castle to go after Fisk. But Fisk ends up imprisoning Frank Castle plus a ton of others, and Matt decides he needs to form an army to go after Wilson Fisk. This brings us into the main events of Captain America Brave New World, where Sam Wilson is actually invited to an event hosted by President Ross with his new Falcon Joaquin Torres and a former super soldier known as Isaiah Bradley, who was actually imprisoned because he was an illegal experiment and was kept in prison to keep hidden before he was eventually released. Sam and all of them go to an event where Ross actually reveals that the island that Tiamat turned into at the end of Eternals is now littered with a rare resource known as adamantium, and he's working with a peace treaty to share it with the world. However, at this event, Isaiah Bradley actually turns into an assassin who tries to kill Ross. Sam and Joaquin end up working together to discover a secret behind-the-scenes experimentation where Samuel Stearns, the man who tried to help Bruce Banner undo his Hulk thing, has actually got some of Bruce's blood into his brain and turned into a super powerful intelligent being known as the Leader. He actually was the one who came up with the strategy that got Ross into presidency, and he now is trying to get Ross thrown out because he keeps him locked away in a secret bunker. Eventually, while he still tries to undo Ross's whole reputation, Sam and Joaquin are able to try to undo most of it, and Joaquin ends up accidentally bedridden in the hospital before Leader ends up revealing his final piece of the puzzle, where he has apparently been giving Ross these pills, which have been actually curing his heart cancer. However, he has been slowly inputting gamma radiation into these pills, and Ross can now turn into a Hulk, Red Hulk. Sam actually fights Red Hulk and eventually able to get Ross to calm down, and he turns back into a normal man. Of course, due to his condition, he is actually then imprisoned on the raft with the Leader himself, but at the same time, he has become a better man, and he ends up having a visit with his long-lost daughter, Betty Ross. While at the same time, Sam actually ends up visiting Samuel Stearns, the Leader, and he ends up revealing that he's done the equation and that something is coming for them at some point. This leads Sam and Joaquin to decide it's time to reform the Avengers. This leads us into the events of Thunderbolts, where Valentina is currently still actually become under investigation due to the government coming after her, and she needs to eliminate all of her loose threads. This includes setting up a vault that's meant to burn all of the evidence surrounding her company, a shady company she's involved in. And part of it is she needs to get rid of some of the agents she'd hired. That includes Taskmaster, Ghost, Yelena Belova, and U.S. Agent. The four of them are led into this fire vault, and actually Taskmaster ends up dying. The rest of them end up actually breaking out of this vault alongside a new guy named Bob Reynolds. They're able to escape the custody, but Bob ends up getting captured by Valentina and the rest of her military people after learning Bob is not entirely what he seems. While they're actually escaping, they also team up with Red Guardian, who came to warn Yelena, but a little bit too late. But they are then caught up by Bucky Barnes, who actually wants to use them as they are all evidence against Valentina, who he is trying to make sure they get out of office. And they eventually end up finding that Valentina actually is the one who purchased Avengers Tower and is now using it as a secret base. They end up going there and find that Valentina has actually turned Bob into a superhero known as Sentry. He fights this new team that they've formed, but he ends up beating them instantly. But when Sentry gets a little bit too smart to wonder why he's taking orders from Valentina, he tries to kill her, but she uses a kill switch on him, which just turns him into a dark creature known as the Void, who ends up trapping the entirety of New York City in a pocket-like dimension where they're forced to live out their worst fears. The new team, known as kind of the Thunderbolts, team up to try to free Bob, where Bob is actually able to beat his Void counterparts and able to get everybody free. The team is then cornered by Valentina in a press tour, and she announces them as the new Avengers. This jumps us to 14 months later to 2028 to the post-credit scene of Thunderbolts, where the new Avengers are hanging out in their new base, which is Avengers Tower, where they end up learning about some space crisis, where they learn about a space crisis that they apparently didn't know about, because they're also in a little bit of a legal battle with Sam Wilson, who wants to call his team the Avengers, but they want to be called the Avengers too. It's a whole thing, but they end up learning about a space crisis, and when they look up image of the incident, they end up seeing a ship enter the atmosphere with a 4 logo on it. And that brings us to the end of the MCU timeline as it stands right now. I just want to thank you guys all very much. If you made it all the way through the entire series, make sure to leave a like, subscribe. If you guys like what I do here, then please do this. This makes me know that you guys like what I do. But without further ado, thank you guys all very much for watching this series, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Bye, guys.